Okay, thank you, thank you. Welcome, welcome. Is the sound okay? You can hear me? All right. Thanks for spending your evening with us. You won't regret it. I'm Michelle Holman with Community Rights Lane County. We are the folks that are working to secure the rights of communities, not corporations, to decide our futures. It seems we've forgotten who we are. We are the people. We are the sovereign. That's how it works in a democracy, which we really don't know anything about because we've never had one in the US. It's a good idea, so we think we should try it, and we're hoping that all of you think it's a good idea and want to join us in trying to create a democracy. The government and corporations have to know that they work for us. And at this point, that seems to be lost on both counts. Community rights work requires us to exercise our constitutionally granted power. And that power can take the form of many, many different avenues, but the way that we see it is that there are unjust laws that hang over our heads, and we, the people, have to write just laws that counteract that. The reason so much corporate behavior is occurring carte blanche is because it is legal. So just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right, and oftentimes a patriot is a person who disobeys the law. So in the ways of community rights, we people believe that we have the right to protect ourselves from corporate harm right where we live. And right here in Lane County, as you know, we're working to ban aerial herbicide spray. Yeah. So it's more important and more relevant than ever that we empower local dialogue and authorize local lawmaking, because not only can we not count on our federal government, but the new administration is really making it more difficult in many ways, emboldening corporations, environmental destruction, fueling racial tensions, dividing families by deporting individual members, attacking unions. So we strive for social, economic, racial, and environmental justice, because there is no justice when our government and our laws embolden corporations to put profits over people and planet. So, yeah, this is a passion ride. I mean, we believe what we're doing is the right thing to be doing. We know it's true. And we really know it when we get pushback from the powers that be. Then we really know we're on the right path. So in light of the work we're doing with the aerial sprays, we decided that we would bring Ernie Niemi, who is a natural resource economist, to talk to us about the general framework, the general landscape of Oregon's logging climate. Ernie specializes in applying the principles of cost-benefit analysis, economic valuation, and economic impact analysis to describe the economic importance of natural resources. He formed Natural Resource Economics Incorporated in 2012. From 1978 to 2012, he managed economic and policy analysis for the consulting firm Economist, where he was a co-owner, vice president, and senior economist. He's also taught cost-benefit analysis and economic development for UO's Department of Planning, Public Policy, and Management, and taught high school as a Peace Corps volunteer in Uganda. He's presented analytical findings on resource management issues to congressional, judicial, arbitrative, administrative, multinational, and scientific professional bodies, and tonight he's going to present to us. He got his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at the University of Oregon and his Master of City and Regional Planning at Harvard University. We are so lucky to have Ernie present to us tonight. Please help me welcome Ernie Niemi.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Of all of those places where I've presented, this is the type of presentation that I enjoy the most and I think is the most important. So thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I respect your participation in this event. given that perspective, I'm not here to listen to myself. I'm here to give you some information that I hope you will find useful. So as we go along, if I have said something and it's not clear, ask, or make it useful to you. I reserve the right to respond right then, or I can respond later. If you want to argue, that's fine too. I can do that. I probably will defer until afterwards because Michelle had asked me to come here and talk about the presentation that I'm going to present here. One thing that I will very clearly ask of you is that you do not go away and say that I am anti-logging, because I am not anti-logging. Do not go away and say that I am anti-aerial spraying, because I am not anti-aerial spraying. What I am is I'm anti-stupid decisions. And stupid decisions occur from an economic perspective when the costs exceed the benefits. But if the benefit of cutting down a tree exceeds the cost, cut the tree down. If the cost exceeds the benefit, then it's stupid to cut the tree down because we're worse off when we do that. So, a lot of this has a particular sort of outcome and interpretation of the timber industry and its activities, but it is not sort of an ideological perspective. It is a description of the benefits and the costs. I am not going to present a conclusion about the timber industry, about aerial spraying. I leave that to you. I'm here to give you information. You will see that an awful lot of this information is not Ernie Niemi's information. It comes from governmental and academic reports. I'm almost exclusively a reporter here. There are a few places where I've done some arithmetic with numbers from governmental and scientific and academic reports, and I'll try to highlight those for you, but it's just arithmetic. It's not that I did some analysis and these are Ernie Niemi's findings. Some of you may have heard what I'm going to talk about here way back in the 1990s. Because in the 1990s, from an economic perspective, we knew almost everything that I'm going to talk about here. So that by about 1996, economists stopped paying attention to the timber industry in Oregon because we already understood what was going on. We understood what the benefits were and what the costs were. So some of this is going to be very old. Some of it will be very old, but with a new set of clothes on it because we have updated data. But for the most part, except for the part about climate change, which we didn't understand very well in the 90s, for the most part, all of this is old stuff. There's nothing really very new about it. To let you know who I am, I grew up in Oregon. I was born in Klamath Falls, grew up there, attended the University of Oregon, as Michelle indicated, came back. I helped build the firm Eco Northwest. When I left, we were the largest economic consulting firm sort of east of Denver and north of San Francisco. I worked primarily on the natural resource economics issues. And in 2012, I broke off. I want to talk about sustainability. Sustainability in particular of industrial timber production in the state of Oregon, Western Oregon, almost exclusively. This comes from the Oregon Board of Forestry, which is important to you because when you're talking about aerial herbicides, you're primarily talking about state and private forests. And so this is how the Board of Forestry thinks about what its mission is, what it is trying to sustain. Next. What does that mean? Well, I don't think anybody knows what sustainability means. Okay? But we know what direction it is. We know that something is more sustainable than something else. The questions of whether a particular type of behavior is actually sustainable really has an awful lot of complexity to it, and my understanding from the science and certainly from the economics is that we really don't know. We really can't say for certain that something is sustainable, but the Board of Forestry says that this is what it means. You want to continue the production of things. From an economic perspective, you want to do this. Because if you don't do this, we know that something is not sustainable. And then there's an issue here of fairness. And one way to think about fairness, building on the comments that the introduction that Michelle gave, a corporation operates with a social license. It's one way that social scientists talk about that. And that society allows a corporation to do what it wants to do, and if the society decides that that's not acceptable, it stops it. Now, it may stop it by changing laws, it may stop it by burning it down, it may stop it by any number of means, through a boycott. But a corporation basically has to continue to demonstrate that it is behaving in society's best interest, that it is fair, that it is a responsible member of the community. Otherwise, it loses its license to operate. There are lots of ways that it does this, and there's an awful lot of ways that it is imperfect. It basically operates through a political system, and as Michelle indicated, there's reason to believe that the political system yields outcomes that are a long ways away from what you and I might consider to be fair. Nonetheless, the concept of fairness as part of sustainability does apply. And as I sit here as a social scientist and look at what you are doing through this and that, and why you're here, that's why. You're trying to evaluate, you're trying to execute the social license to operate. So, what I want to talk about this, I want to talk about internal sustainability, timber production. I also want to talk about what economists talk about, the external effects. Okay, the effects on workers, water, all of these that are external to the corporation, because all of those determine the overall sustainability of the industry's behavior. Next. So I want to talk about this. Next. Pre-1993. That arrow ought to be pointing here at 1993. 1993 is when President Bill Clinton initiated the process that resulted in the Northwest Forest Plan that reduced logging on federal lands in Western Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. This graph shows timber harvest. It's a little hard to read, and I apologize for that. This is private land, private industry. This is federal. And this is other small private and state up here. So basically what happened in 1993 is that federal timber harvest dropped way down. Well, you look at that then and you say the pre-1993, this level of harvest was up around 8 billion board feet. That was not sustainable because it dropped down. But the industry people say, that's just because of those damn spotted owls and environmentalists. If we didn't have them, we could have kept cutting forever and ever and ever. One of the messages I hope you can take away from here, especially the people who are not as old as I am, is that that's just bullshit. Way back here, this is 1982. Way back here, 1976. 1976, the publisher of the paper in Medford looked out his window, saw this unending line of log trucks, and wondered, can we just keep doing this? He pressured the governor to pressure Oregon State University to answer the question, are we going to run out of logs? 1976, John Buter, professor at Oregon State University, came out with his report and said, yep, we're going to run out. And folks, this is just sort of mind-boggling at that time, because people had always heard that we are never going to run out of trees. Here for the first time in Oregon, for the first time on the West Coast, you had a credible analysis saying we're going to run out of trees. And guess when he said we're going to run out? We're going to run out right then. 1990. So, in 1993, the Northwest Forest Plan, from an economic perspective, that decision was not about owls. That decision was simply that we're running out of trees. And as trees become more scarce, they become more expensive to get. And basically, it just didn't make sense to go after the rest of those trees. That was an unsustainable level of logging right there. Next, please. But if you look since then, and this is a graph from 1986, Oregon timber harvest, and here we were up about 8 billion up here, but after the Northwest Forest Plan came into effect, we've been at about 4 billion board feet. And it goes up and down, this is the recession, but it came back. You look at that and you say, that's basically sustainable. Looks like we can for a long time, just keep right on going. And if you talk to the people in the industry, they say they can continue to do that. So there's some reason that it is internally sustainable. Next. But there's something else going on here. This is a graph that comes from the Oregon Department of Forestry. Not really in anything that very many people saw. And there's actually a story here. I'm going to tell the story. Last winter, Oregon Department of Forestry was holding hearings on its proposed changes about how wide the buffer had to be around streams. A wider buffer, more trees, more shade, water's colder, better for fish. Pretty simple. When I went and talked to them, they said, we considered an awful lot of alternatives, and we weighed the benefits of, is it this far or this far, this far or that far. We weighed the benefits against the cost, and this is our proposal. I thought, great. That's the way economics ought to work. Give me the information. So they sent me the report, 40 plus pages, and on the front it says, this is compliance with state law that says before we change any rule, we have to tell the public what are the benefits, what are the costs. This is our report. 40 plus pages. I went through every one of them. 40 plus pages of the costs to the industry of going from this to this. Not a single word, not a single syllable, not a single letter about the benefits of having more trees so you have more shade, so you have colder water in the streams. Buried in the back of this is this. And as they're talking about the cost to the industry of protecting more land next to the streams, they say, well, but the cost is actually going to be going down because you see the value of logs is going down, and we don't see any reason for that to not continue to go down. So the previous slide, they continue to log 4 billion board feet, but the value of those logs is going down. That's an indicator that it is not sustainable. Here's another indicator. This map, put together by Oregon Department of Forestry and the Forest Service, identifies the lands of big timber owners, big industry timber owners, lands that are owned by Wall Street financial institutions. It's not owned by mills, not owned by timber companies, but owned by Wall Street. Wall Street, no surprise, has a focus on short-term profits, not long-term sustainability. So just as you step back and look at the institutional structure of this industry, half of the industry's land is probably, it's reasonable to anticipate, is not going to be managed for long-term sustainability. It's going to be sustained for short-term profits. And we've all had some experience, sort of in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we have some experience of what happens with short-term focuses. Okay, next. This information comes from a 2005 report. The lead author is a woman named Cheryl Talbert, who at that time was the Weyerhaeuser's head of Western lands. Right? So she's a big person in that organization. And this is an assessment of timber production, the timber industry in Western Oregon and Washington in the larger global context, because this is a global industry. And she says, there's this perception that we are this all-powerful industry, but in a global sense, we're not. So in 2005, for example, we could produce 190 cubic feet per acre on our lands. But if you go to Chile and New Zealand, they can produce that. And in the future, through fertilizer and the like, aerial spraying, we can bump that up, but so can they. We are not going to be the dominant force in this industry. The silvicultural cost. We have twice their cost. That's the cost of growing trees. Our rate of return is just a little bit more than 1/2 of their rate of return on our investment. Next. So what does that mean? That means we have to shorten the rotation length, grow our trees faster, which is really saying we need to cut our costs. We need to, because we invest money to plant the trees, we need to get that money back sooner. We have to reduce our cost. What's their number one cost? And we have to maintain our license to operate. Dynamite paper. You know, this woman is really smart. And she really laid it out just exactly the way that it is from their perspective. That is some context that says there is no guarantee that the industry as it operates in Western Oregon and Western Washington is going to be able to continue to operate on a sustainable basis, because in a competitive sense, it doesn't dominate. It's always going to be vulnerable. Now, you can complain about what happens in Chile and New Zealand as well, but you know, that's a time for a different discussion. So, that was the internal context. That's some sense of what's happening from their eyes on the sustainability of their operations. By the way, I want to make it very clear. When I say industry, I'm really talking about the big companies. I know that there are people in Lane County and all the way up and down Western Oregon especially. People are trying to do it different. They really are, and they're doing a great job. A guy named Dave Eisler out here beyond Walton, if you ever get a chance to go out and see his property, it's really pretty super. Now I want to talk about the external part of this, the external sustainability of the timber industry in Western Oregon. Next. Let's talk about workers. What we're going to see is that there are fewer jobs, lower wages. So if there's some sense of the sustainability of good jobs, this is what I've been talking about. Log exports from Oregon ports. 1961, 2012, went up. Here's where we've been basically since about 1998. All right, so this is after the adjustment to the Northwest Forest Plan. By the year 2000, we're beyond the Northwest Forest Plan. It's all in some sort of equilibrium. We're bumping along here at about 400 million. Okay, 4 billion was cut. 400 million was exported. That's 1 log out of 10. Boom, it jumps up to more than 1 log out of 5. There is some evidence that indicates that beyond this, it actually went to 1 log out of 2 for a while. There's some evidence that people saying they're now back down to 1 log out of 10. The point being that we have an industry that operates a big chunk of what it does is it exports logs. When it exports logs, it also exports jobs. Right? So part of its behavior built into its position in a global market involves exporting jobs, more or less. This is jobs per log. This looks at logging and wood production manufacturing, the industry, the core parts of the industry, jobs per million board feet that's been harvested. This is from 1990, so this is when we get into the Northwest Forest Plan. It goes up some, and then it's been going down since about 1997, 1998. Used to be about 12 jobs per million board feet. We're now down to less than 6, about 6. And again, there's no reason for that to not continue to go down because the industry wants to cut costs, and labor is its biggest cost. Sustainability of good jobs and workers has a very powerful message. And then, for the workers that remain, and this is just a stunning graph when I show it to other economists because it is so counterintuitive. If you go back into the 1970s, you have the average wage for all workers in Oregon. This is adjusted for inflation. Average wage for all workers, timber industry wages. There used to be about a 30% premium in the 1970s if you worked in the timber industry. This is why when I went to college and I worked for a summer at a Weyerhaeuser mill in Klamath Falls, I could earn enough money to pay for my college because it paid an awful lot of money. But what we see is that that gap has narrowed and it essentially doesn't exist anymore. Why was it able to do that? What sort of happened right here around 1980? Ronald Reagan broke the unions. That's what's happened here. So not only does this industry have to cut costs by getting rid of workers, it has reduced the wages of the remaining workers. Why that is so astounding from an economic position is that which workers do you think they would get rid of? The ones that are less productive. They would keep the ones that are most productive. So you would think they get rid of the ones that are sort of low wage, low production. They would keep the ones that are high wage, high production. You should have seen the average wage go up. That's almost what you always see when you have industries cut wages, cut workers, is that the wages of the average wage goes up, not here. And it's because you had the structural change, the ability to get rid of unionized wages. Here's the cost. If we were operating today with a 30% premium, if we still had unions that could have the strength to dictate that they got paid that 30% premium, every worker in the timber industry would be being paid $12,000 more. Timber industry workers in Lane County would be receiving $51 million more. And timber industry workers in the state of Oregon would be receiving $350 million. Now, where does that money go if it doesn't go to workers?
Wall Street.
Where?
Wall Street.
It goes to Wall Street. It goes to the shareholders. It goes to the managers. Where do most of those people live? Okay, and that's also a big change. Right? When I was growing up, you could drive through the Willamette Valley and you could see any number of mills that were owned by somebody who lived in the community, owned the mill, was part of the community. The workers got some money, the mill owner got some money. That money was basically all held within Oregon. Not entirely, but to a great extent. That's not the case anymore. So this is the industry reaching into a worker's pocket and taking the money back. So if you're trying to sustain income, this is the reality that we're dealing with. Let's talk about water. Okay, next. This is 2017 research published. Researchers from Oregon State University, where you have plantations of Douglas fir, right, industry lands. Stream flow is 50% less. Now, again, having sort of hung around with these people for a long time, they sort of knew this, but this is the first report that I am aware of that actually documents and quantifies how big of an impact that is. Now, most of that reduction in stream flow occurs not in the wintertime, but in the summertime, when stream flow is really very critical to fish and an awful lot of other critters. So, the impact on stream temperatures is that you see a 1.3 degrees Celsius increase on private timberlands. This again is research published in 2011 from Oregon State University. As we know, if you've been paying attention to climate change issues, 1.3 degrees Celsius sounds like a small number, but it's big. This is a big impact on fish. Okay. And then here are two items that I find fascinating. This one is a satellite photograph. And it's from 2016, and it shows the coast. This is California coming up. There's Cape Blanco, Oregon and Washington. And it shows phytoplankton on the beach. or in the ocean right off the beach on the west coast. This is, you and I grew up, we call this red tide stuff. It kills you. If your dog goes out and swims in the ocean, dies. Okay. There's a projection that this is just going to continue to get worse. It's going to go all the way up into Alaska because of global warming going on. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the timber industry contributes to that. And one of the ways it contributes is the previous slide that says it delivers warmer water into the ocean through streams throughout the summertime. This one is analysis that was just done a month ago, published a month ago. And this shows where we have blue-green algae appearing in the summertime in our lakes and our streams. And again, we've started to hear a lot more about this in, say, Dexter Reservoir. Or we hear about it in some of the mountains in the Cascades. Again, very deadly, kills your dog. You don't want to get into it. And one of the places where we are seeing this already, and we're going to see even more of it by 2090 that projects, is right here. When you have an activity, an industrial activity that warms that water, coming down out of the mountains, going into the reservoir, it accelerates that. I mean, this is just stepping on the gas pedal. Okay. About drinking water. This is a map put together by USGS, and this is percentage of surface water, surface drinking water. So water that is obtained from surface water sources that comes from intermittent, ephemeral, and headwater streams in Oregon. Right? So it's the percentage of the water that comes from mountainous, forested places. And basically what we see here is it's about 50%. So it's coming from this. Next. And it's coming from that. There's one of those places right there. There's what the timber industry does to those places. So this is providing you some insight to the sustainability of drinking water as an external effect of industrial timber operations in Western Oregon. The water costs. This is, in fact, some arithmetic that I have done looking at analysis for reduction in stream flow. And basically it's about $800 per acre logged, the loss of water in the stream. And this is the reduction in water quality. This is not any of the things that I talked about. This is just about dirt in the water. It isn't the toxic stuff. That's about $500 per acre. So these are all, I think it's safe to say, low ball estimates of the costs we incur from the impacts of industrial logging on water. Okay. Let's talk about salmon. Talk about these three things. I've already talked about this, sort of direct impacts from temperature and reduced stream flow. So I've already covered that. Let's talk about this. This is a pair of maps coming from the real EPA. So it's from under the Obama administration. It's published just about 2 years ago. And what it shows is blue is water that is cold enough to support what are called cold water fish, salmon, steelhead, trout, and projected to remain cold in the year 2100 without climate change. With climate change, and we're actually on a faster path of climate change than this analysis assumed. This is what happens. An awful lot of this blue now becomes red, which is it's currently cold enough to support cold water fish, but by the end of the century it will not be. And we're already seeing this. There are already places. It's not that we get to 2100 and you turn a switch and all of it becomes hot water. There's places out there already that are too hot for fish. This is one of the most powerful slides that I've ever presented over many, many years in many communities in Oregon, where people are initially hostile to anything that challenges the timber industry because people care about fish. They care about fish an awful lot. One of the ways that economists talk about the importance, the economic importance of fish is that we look at how much they pay for fish at the supermarket. We look at how much they pay to go fishing. There are people out in this world who pay more than $1,000 to go fishing, $1,000 per fish. I've done that, to go to Alaska and fish. Right, so there's some real value there. But then there's this notion of fish are something more than just, let's catch them on a hook or let's eat them. And so economists have devised very sophisticated surveys and behavioral tests to see how important are fish. And one of the ways that you do this is you say, how much are people willing to pay to increase salmon populations by, say, 50%? Or alternatively, to pay to prevent a 50% reduction. And for Oregon and Washington, that number is about $300 a household. All right. So if all of that represents a 50% reduction, then it's $300 per household. They're about if you multiply that times Oregonians, you get about this. But that's if it's only a 50% reduction. What we're talking about here is much more than that. This may be sort of 100%. They're gone. The water's cold enough, but this isn't enough to sustain. The habitat isn't that good. This is why it says it's more than $300 a year. It's probably a lot more than $300 a year because you're taking salmon out of a region. Timothy Egan, very well-known reporter for the New York Times on the Pacific Northwest, has defined the Pacific Northwest as where the salmon are. And I think that's pretty apt description. So, salmon cost. Climate change. Sort of the economic view of this is you have emissions, changes in climate, you have direct economic damage, and then you have impacts on the economy. Because as we're dealing with environmental disasters, we've had some of those. When we're dealing with that, we don't do other things, and so we forego the economic growth that we otherwise would have had. Economists, a lot of economists, understand this very well. Okay. There are some in Washington, D.C. who apparently don't. But we understand this. Here's what we see, the average temperature change for 2011-14 compared to the average for the last century. A lot of people think, because there are maps that say, the Pacific Northwest, we're going to avoid climate change. It's here. Remember the ice storms? Okay. Extreme weather events? Okay. Extreme fire events? Okay. It's here. Why are forests important? Well, they're important because as the tree grows, it takes carbon dioxide out when you cut the tree. When you cut the tree, according to scientists at Oregon State University, in that logging operation, about 1/4 of the carbon in that tree goes into the atmosphere. And you can think about the small things that, they rot pretty quickly or they're burned as slash. So about 1/4 goes up very quickly, sort of within the year. Another 1/4 goes into the atmosphere during the processing, the manufacturing. Think about burning hog fuel, if you will. So that's 2/4. Go up into the atmosphere basically within the year, maybe 2 years. A 1/3 1/4 goes up into the atmosphere from the products of this process. And a large part of that is this, which goes into a landfill and it rots pretty quickly and goes up. Now there are some things like this that hold the carbon out of the atmosphere for quite some time. And this part of it then is about 1/4 of all of that. So when the industry says we take carbon out of the atmosphere, well, they do, but it's not a one-to-one thing, okay? Because 3/4 of it goes right back up. This is especially important here. What this says is total carbon tons per acre in the forest, and this is 88 tons per acre, and we live in an area that's a lot more than that. We live in an area, Western Oregon, Washington, Northern California, British Columbia, that can hold more carbon per acre in an ecosystem than almost any other place in the world. There are a few other places, but they are not very large. This is the carbon bank for the world. That's why logging and discussions about climate change cannot be separated in this region. And this is what we're dealing with. Carbon emissions from logging, state and private lands in Oregon, basically 1/4 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state come from logging on state and private lands. Oregon cannot achieve its climate goals without dealing with trees. The Obama administration, following its endorsement of the Paris Agreement in 2015, following that, it did an awful lot of analysis. It's really great stuff. It says the United States cannot satisfy its obligations under the Paris Agreement unless it grows more trees and it lets the existing trees get bigger. Because that is our only reliable mechanism right now for sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So trees are an integral part of any discussion, any meaningful discussion of climate change. Here's some arithmetic that I have done, okay? So if you look just at state and private lands, that amount of timber, that amount of carbon that they're emitting into the atmosphere, times the value per ton of carbon dioxide. What do I mean by that? Scientists have said carbon dioxide goes up. Remember that diagram? Carbon dioxide goes up here, and then you have all these damages over here. They've documented how those damages materialize. Economists have followed that around and said, well, hurricanes, okay. We can calculate or estimate the damage for a hurricane. We can estimate the damage for wildfires. We can estimate the damage for sea level rise. We can estimate the damage for impacts on crops. We can estimate damage for an awful lot, relate that to a ton of carbon dioxide and come up with a number. And the Obama administration did that. 2013, for about right now, it's about $50 a ton. The Governmental Accountability Office looked at the process that they used. They said, hey, this is the best scientific analytical process that you could have. All right, it is not influenced by anything. If anything, it documents that that number, $50 per ton, is too low. So $50 per ton says that the cost, the damage to the world from logging on state and private lands in Oregon at $50 per ton is about $750 million. But there are a lot of things that doesn't take into account. So the literature that is available right now that says here's the things that they missed in 2013 pushes that up to here. Logging on state and private lands causes $10 billion of damage a year, at least. How can I say at least? Because this number, for example, does not include impacts on the oceans. Ocean acidification, ocean warming, the impacts on the ability of the oceans to produce fish, ability of the oceans to produce oxygen. So there's real strong reason to believe that this is a low number. Now, the Trump administration has come back and said, no, this is all wrong. Carbon dioxide is really a good thing. Okay, here's some description of the different ways that you and I will incur some of those costs. This is just sort of a, go out and grab around, and these are the different ways that it's there. It's important because an awful lot of people sort of think, well, okay, hurricanes, smoke, yeah, I get it. But that's it. No, it's an awful lot of things. These things. Migration. Does anybody really think that people out of the South are not going to move here? And that those people are not going to somehow affect our quality of life, affect our ability to provide services, schools, water treatment, and the like? Okay. An awful lot of things. Does it kill people? It certainly does. We have had enough heat wave events to kill people in Seattle, which is a very cold town. It doesn't take much. Logging on BLM lands. Work that they did, 2016, because they have a brand new plan that's going to increase logging on BLM lands in Western Oregon, called the O&C lands. In their analysis, I'll give them credit, they are the only federal agency that I know that has done this. And I say that in part because the Forest Service has not done this, and they have been sued and they have lost. Okay, but the BLM took that into account. They provided the numbers so that we could look at the value of the timber, the benefits, we could look at the climate cost. The costs, my very first sentence, okay? So we could do that. They provide the numbers, but they never did the side-by-side comparison. If you ever see them, ask them why. Okay? They say when they log timber, that timber per truckload is worth $1,220. Per acre, it's about $6,400. The climate cost at $50 per ton is this. If we take into account the research that is available since 2013 and not in that $50 a ton, we get those. Okay, your computer is different than my computer. Per truckload, it's $70,000 per truckload. You see a truckload of logs coming from BLM lands out in Lost Creek, where I live. That truckload is carrying $70,000 worth of climate costs. Per acre, when I look up at the hillside and see that they've logged an acre of land, that acre, that logging, has climate costs of almost $400,000 that we can quantify today. Does not include the oceans. Remember that map? Why are trees here, especially here, important? This is why we know that that's important. Sustainable? Next. Let's talk about communities. We hear an awful lot. We need to log in order to have sustainable rural communities. At least I've heard that a lot. I suspect you have. Let's talk about what the timber industry does actually to stability, social disruption, and social services. Apologize for this. Again, these are reports. These are charts that other people put together. This one is put together by the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. These are the economists that report to the governor and the legislature directly. The blue line is employment from January 1956 through January 2010. And so it's employment in Oregon goes up and down. Employment in the timber industry is going up and down on steroids. No surprise. This is an industry that is extremely unstable. It's unstable because it's so dependent upon interest rates. I mean, not in the last 10 years or so, but before that, every time interest rates went up, timber industry went down. Okay, when interest rates went down, timber industry would jump up. People would work in the summer, they'd be on unemployment in the winter, up and down, up and down, up and down. So just in terms of the stability of a community, this is an industry that basically brings instability to that community. Now, the Northwest Forest Plan basically created an opportunity of a lifetime for sociology PhD students. Because here you had, across a very large area, Western Oregon, Washington, Northern California, you were going to have this dramatic change in how much logging would occur on federal lands. Right? Remember the very first slide, the blue logging versus the red logging? You're going to lose almost all that blue logging. Let's go out and find out the reduction in logging, the types of social discord and mayhem and chaos and catastrophe that a reduction in logging on federal lands was going to cause in communities throughout. And so you had sociologists up and down, from San Francisco to Canada. Well, in 2000, they sort of got together. This is the National Research Council, pulled these researchers together, looked at all of the research, and said, how bad was it? And they said, oh, what the research really shows is that communities that are more dependent upon timber have more problems. Communities that are less dependent upon timber have fewer of these problems. Getting rid of the logging on federal forest lands did not exacerbate social problems in our rural communities. It relaxed those social problems in our rural communities. Well, how could that be? Because you have all these people out in rural Oregon, rural Lane County, that no longer have jobs. Number one, the jobs that they had were extremely unstable. Okay? And so what you had was, Joe's working in the summertime, laid off in the wintertime, beats his kids and his wife. And when it happened, I mean, come on. What you had is that the industry had cut all of its lands, is cutting almost all of the federal lands. And so you have that instability, sort of permanent instability, my very first slide. And then what you have is, from the 1950s until now, you've had some really, really, really important changes in our economy and in our transportation system. So in the 1990s, what my research found is that it didn't matter so much where you lived, it mattered how close you were to a metropolitan area and to Interstate 5, because people commute. People in Oak Ridge got really screwed when the mills there closed. The mills there closed not because of spotted owls, but because Pope and Talbot cut all their lands. People in Oak Ridge commute down Highway 58. Now Highway 58's sort of a death mill of a road, but okay. But people could commute. People could commute from Cottage Grove. People could commute from Lebanon into Salem. And so this notion that you had rural communities that are isolated, and when you no longer can log, the sawmill is going to close. That sawmill was already gone and was consolidated into sawmills along I-5. One of the interesting factoids is that you look at the total milling capacity in Western Oregon. All right? How many 2x4s could they produce? It has gone up since the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented. It has gone up as the number of mills has gone down by several hundred. How can that be? Well, if you ever drive down south of Cottage Grove and you look over and you see that big Weyerhaeuser mill sitting out there, ever see the long, the big stacks of 2x4s and like, do you ever see a worker? Okay, I drive past that at least once a week. And the number of times that I see a worker out there during a year is fewer than 10. That mill can produce a tremendous amount of timber. And so, stability, social discord. Next. Social services. You can say, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, we've got these problems, but at least the timber industry generates tax revenue to support social services in rural Oregon. That's why we need to cut more logs, is to have more money to support taxes. Well, let's look at taxes. Most local governments are supported by property tax. We have Oregon education, and money comes from the state, but Most local governments property tax. Private forest land pays a property tax in 2008, 2009. This is information from the Oregon Revenue Department, $5 million. This is in quotes because some of it is paid as actual property tax like you and I pay. Some of it for small landowners, they don't pay a property tax year by year, but when they cut trees, then they reimburse the county for property taxes that they didn't pay. So it's property taxes, okay? $5 million. But there are 10 million acres of private forest land. So the tax per acre is 50 cents. Well, Monday or Tuesday of next week, you're in your mail. How many of you are homeowners? Okay, you're going to open up your mail and you're going to have your property taxes. Okay, 2008, 2009. We talk about property taxes as the amount per $1,000 of real market value, right? So it's a tax per $1,000 of real market value. What do you think it is about? It's about 10, about 12. Right? For 2008, 2009, let's call it 10. Okay? So you pay, for every $1,000 what your house is worth, you pay $10 in tax. They pay 1/100th of 1/100th of a dollar per $1,000 of real market value. So we're talking about social services and the industry's contribution to social services. We're talking about social contracts. When I grew up, I understood, because I lived in one of these communities, and then as I went to university, I learned the social science of, you had this agreement, basically. We're going to cut the trees, liquidate our assets, and we're going to share the money from liquidating those assets 3 ways. To workers, remember the graph about workers? We're going to share it to the communities, we're going to pay taxes, and then it goes to the mill owners, property owners. 3-way share. They've taken it away from the workers. The mill owners don't live here anymore. The property owners don't live here anymore. And this is what they pay in taxes. But the deal was, let's pay a tax when you cut the trees, a harvest tax. But in 1993, with the Northwest Forest Plan, the industry was able to spook Oregon's legislature and say, oh, we're going to die, we're going to die. All rural communities are going to die in Oregon. Shut out the lights. Oregon's economy is on its knees. That is a quote from an industry economist. You have to do something, give us relief. The relief was to say you no longer have to pay a harvest tax. Well, not quite. You have to pay a harvest tax. It's about $10 million a year. But it's a harvest tax that comes from the industry's left pocket and goes to their right pocket because it pays for the Oregon Forest Resources Institute in Portland, which is a public relations arm of the industry. It used to say that on their website. They then took it down. It pays for forest management professors at Oregon State. It pays for people to fight forest fires on their lands, and it pays for the Department of Forestry, the Oregon Department of Forestry, to administer the regulations that allow them to log. That's where that $10 million go. None of that $10 million goes for social services. But Washington and California didn't buy into that. They maintained their forest harvest tax. This is a chart put together by the Oregon Department of Forestry. It's the only, as far as I know, it's the only time that they have ever put together anything like this. It was part of a special process that Governor Kitzhaber had going on to try to increase logging, and so the department was willing to put this together. What it shows is how much money the 18 Western Oregon counties would have received if Oregon had the Washington tax, the California tax, this is the Oregon tax. The Washington tax and the California tax go to social services. This shows that California tax is less than Washington. Actually, out here, California raised their timber harvest tax, so it's up here very close to Washington's. So this is how much money Western Oregon counties could have had for social services if we had Washington's tax or California's tax. This dotted line is for Washington. Washington has a peculiar thing where they say 80% of all the money collected has to go directly to the county. So the state as a whole is losing about $50 million. The counties are losing about $40 million, the dotted line. So the decision by the industry in 1993 to persuade the legislature to get rid of the forest harvest tax in Oregon, even though it still has a forest harvest tax in Washington and California, costs us social services of about $50 million a year. Now, if you've ever driven into Western Washington, ever driven into Northern California, do you sort of get to the border and see that they stop logging because there's a harvest tax? No. They're very willing to pay that harvest tax. This is chump change to them. They're very willing to do that. But if Oregon isn't going to do it, why pay it? And so we're talking about social services. All right? President Clinton understood that there was a problem here because the counties are no longer going to get money from federal forests. So there was separate legislation to directly pay money to the counties. Sort of transition away from a timber industry to a more diversified industry. Part of that was to pay for education. Sidebar. 1976. The John Buter report. My very first slide, 1976. I was a cub economist then, working in Roseburg. It was my job to brief the county commissioners and the mill owners on the Buter report. You're going to run out of logs in 15 years. County commissioner, I believe it was Ray Dorner, but I'm not sure, said, my God, we've got to let people know so that they can start to plan. I'm sure we can get federal money for a community college. Get people, the mill workers and their wives, so they can get more training. So the kids aren't sort of channeled into working in the mills. And Fred Sohn, who at the time owned Sun Studs, one of the big mills in Roseburg, you will do no such thing. If you do that, I will lose my very best workers because they're going to go to community college and go find another job, and I'm not going to have it. So we are not going to tell anybody anything about this. We're going to keep it quiet. And in fact, it never got into the newspaper, it never got onto the TVs. So one of the things that's important here, social services, we hear about how bad it is in rural Oregon. Social services, part of that is education, part of it is getting people into transitions away from a timber industry. And you have the industry come along and cut it off at the knees. And there's the cost. So for every one of you, the timber industry is grabbing about $12. For Lane County, it's about $4.5 million. Okay. That's the impact on social services. Next. The whole economy. What about the rest of the economy? We're going to speed this up a little bit. Here's Oregon wood products employment, 1950 to 2014. And it used to be around 90,000, 85, 90,000. It's now down here around 30,000. This is the 1990s. This is a Northwest Forest Plan. You lost an awful lot of jobs, but it wasn't the spotted owl. Only about 1/3 of this is really attributable to the Northwest Forest Plan. The other 2/3 is mill owners getting rid of workers, reducing wages. the unionized things that we were talking about before. So we are now down here around 30,000. Now, the Oregon Forest Resources Institute will say that, oh no, that's about 60 to 70,000. Totally disregard that. This is a public relations arm of the industry. They've thrown all kinds of things in there. So they would have you believe that part of the timber industry are the 5 to 10,000 people that work on conservation projects. Excuse me? Okay, they want you to believe that about 5,000 people are dependent on the timber industry when they're really working on the flip side of the coin. There are all kinds of problems in those numbers. It's about 30,000 workers. Well, maybe it's going to grow. This is the official forecast from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis for 2017, saying that from 2016 to 2020, they expect employment for the state of the whole to grow that much. 300 in the timber industry. But maybe not. Because the Guardian newspaper, great newspaper by the way, recently had an article about this machine here from Finland that the industry is bringing into Western Oregon because it can operate on these very steep slopes in the Coast Range and the Cascades. They cable it up here so that this machine can go back and forth and cut all of those trees. It lifts up the tree, it takes all the limbs off, it stacks it, it takes it over, puts it on a log truck, and out it goes. One of those machines can eliminate 8 workers. So it doesn't take very many of those machines to get rid of that 300. That 300, by the way, is based on the expectation that BLM logging was going to go up. Okay. This is wood products as a percentage of Oregon's GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It's the value of everything we produce, goods and services. Wood products industry used to be 12% in the 1960s. That has declined now. It's down around 1% or less than 1%. This is not an industry that is an engine of growth. This is an industry that's out there 4 billion board feet every year that it logs, and it exports some, doesn't some. We're stuck. It's not going to be an engine of growth. It's a declining part of the economy as the rest of the economy grows. But the question then is, does the wood products industry have an impact on the rest of our economy that is growing, the 137,000 jobs? Does it have an impact on that? And yes, it does. One of the ways is in education. This is research that was just recently published, and it looks at prosperous communities and distressed communities. And it looks at education, and it says high school or less, some college, bachelor's or more. For depressed communities, 2/3 of the adults have less than high school or less. No surprise, for here it's only 1/4 for prosperous communities. Go back several slides. What is the industry doing to our ability to have this? So the industry is undercutting our ability to educate people in metropolitan and rural communities so that they can participate in a prosperous economy. Also, amenities. This is a map from the University of Wisconsin that shows for 2000 to 2010 the net migration, so the number of people moving in minus the number of people moving out on a county-by-county basis. Blue is a net move in, red is a net move out. There's no surprise that Nebraska and Iowa are red, right? How many of you have moved to Oregon? It's more hands than that. Some of you are shy. Okay? Almost all of us. No, I didn't. I was born in Klamath Falls, so okay. But I don't hold that against you. Sure, you look at that. This is the engine of our growth. It's our ability to attract talent in an economy that places a premium on talent, not on brawn. Can attract money because people want to live here. They bring their money with them. They are entrepreneurs. They are investors. This is the determinant of our economic future. Lane County, this is work done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service. County by county, 3,111 counties, they've ranked them according to amenities. It's not perfect. It focuses on climate. So how hot is it on the hottest summer day is bad. Cold, how cold is it on the coldest winter day? That's bad. What sort of topography do you have? Nebraska's bad. What sort of water do you have? Okay. Nebraska's bad.
Flint, Michigan would be bad too, wouldn't it?
Who?
Flint, Michigan?
No, this is amenities. So this is water for recreation. You get to see it. We've got a lot of it. Okay, we've got a lot of it on our west, on our left-hand door. We've got lakes, we've got rivers, we've got all of that. Lane County ranks 177th. Curry County, I think, is 4th. Yeah. Think about it. It's a really nice place. It's really warm in the winter. It's very pleasant in the summer. Okay. So we are living in a place that as people find more and more about this, they're going to look around, and we actually learned about this. Until the mid-1960s, the way that an economy grew, a community grew, was to invest in jobs. You had an investment, created jobs, people would move to the community to fill the jobs. That was slam dunk economics until about the mid-1960s. Then you started to see it was turned upside down. People would move to the community and the jobs would follow. And the reason for that, primary reason for that, is the interstate system. People would go on vacation, they would come from here, they would come out here. How many people have you known that you'll come to the West Coast on summer holiday with the kids in the back of the station wagon, come out here, go back and say, honey, why don't we go out there and give it a try? And they did, and they do. And as we see more and more of this get really, really hot and extreme, people are going to start looking at this sort of ranking and say, boom, let's go there. That's our future. Now, this is important because you have outdoor recreation that comes from those amenities. That's the number of jobs that we have in outdoor recreation versus the timber economy in this state. Also new jobs, 300 over a 4-year period. The outdoor recreation industry claims, they have the data to back it up, that they create about 7,000 new jobs a year. But this is the real killer right here. It is all of those other people that want to move here to work and do something else. This is our economic future. And this is what the timber industry does to it. And so then, this is my conclusion. It's for you to decide what you think. Is it sustainable? So thank you very much.
Yeah, oh God, it's just so depressing. I think, or that's what for you or everybody. Can you give us help us feel less dread? Is there any good news that you have?
Oh, without a doubt.
What's your good news?
The good news is stand up, look around. This is the good news. I have found, and I will find your doppelgangers in communities throughout this state. Last week, I was in Rockaway Beach on the coast. Same presentation. Okay. They're not 177th. I think they were like 70th. Okay, so they're ranked higher than you are. No surprise. This is, and remember the slide about the social license to operate? This is our only hope. Michelle's introduction, this is our only hope. Now, having said that, remember I said the way the industry deals with the social license to operate. It can deal with all of us, or it can deal with the political system. I don't know about you, but last week I got an email from Peter DeFazio saying the reason that we have such a bad deal in the timber industry here is because of those damned Canadians. They out-negotiated us. They are having a, quote, devastating effect on our rural communities. And if we can just, through our president, negotiate a better deal, it's just going to be sustainable. Now, my interpretation of that is that he's either become a Trump acolyte, or that's the political manipulation of the social contract, social license to operate. He will continue to do that. Ron Wyden will continue to do that. Merkley will continue. Kate Brown will continue to do that. The Oregon Department of Forestry will tell you to go to hell about aerial spraying until we say we ain't going to have any more of it. That and the fact that we are having these meetings and we didn't 5 years ago, I see as extremely the only positive thing.
The one chart you showed about the value of a truck of timber and the climate cost showed about a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio of climate cost to timber value. Is there any scenario in which that would be equal, or whether it would be equal or less to the cost?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. At some point, the benefits that you get from cutting the tree, the 2x4, for example, will build shelter that will help save 100 lives. Okay, I get it. We're not making those kinds of decisions now, but I can see that where we could be making those kinds of decisions, we're just wasting wood. I mean, I hate to say this, but in a week, this is going in the trash because I will have been onto another version of this. But sure, absolutely.
Can I get one more?
Sure.
Also, your predictions or your forecasts for the future seem to center on growth, which I'm not particularly a fan of. How are these other jobs that are better than the timber industry jobs not going to find their own way to cause all these damages and ruin the climate?
Okay, so it's a good question. I applaud you for raising that question because a lot of audiences don't. And the issue there is we're comparing timber against other industries that are engines of growth, can generate growth. Well, they generate migration. We have problems and costs that come from migration. Put stress on our water resources. They put stress on our recreational resources. They put stress on owls and on fish and on birds and all of that. I get that. Can have another evening like that, and it'd be a great evening. It'd be a really important evening, and I think that's an evening that we ought to have with our legislators, absolutely. That's part of what Tom McCall did in the 70s with our land use plan. As we wrestled with that, came up with an answer. I think it's still the best answer anywhere in the United States. But the choice that we're dealing with now is, on the margin, timber industry, amenity-driven industry. That's the only choice that we have. Now, it is better if we can get an amenity-driven industry that generates benefits greater than costs. Let's count all the costs. We're not doing that now. We're counting them better than other states do, but we're not counting all of them, but let's count them. So it's a step at a time.
So what percentage of the timber harvested goes to paper and paper products, do you know?
I don't right off.
Because I would submit that if we're going to be stopping recycling programs because China won't accept our paper, that could be a terrific economic opportunity for the state to develop our own.
It could be. It could be, and what I do know is that the paper mills at Oregon Falls, at Oregon City, they've closed. Our West Lynn paper just announced that they are closing. I think that's the last one that's there. So you have the one that's out at near Shed, between here and Corvallis. That one's still operating. Is that the last one in Oregon, Western Oregon? No, there's some up in the Astoria area. And Toledo still operates. Okay, so generally we're going to see less of the raw material going directly into paper in the state simply because the mills are the paper mills are closing. The opportunity that we have then is an opportunity. Who's going to step forward? And is the Oregon legislature going to create incentives for, if not a private sector entrepreneur to do that, for, say, St. Vincent de Paul? I mean, talk about entrepreneurial innovators, I mean, that sort of thing. That's something to hope for.
What are your expectations now? It's sort of like the reaction to disaster economy. That's there's been floods. There's going to be infrastructure's going to have to be rebuilt in Texas, and in Florida there's going to be a demand for new wood products. It's sort of this like.
Remember the map that shows the Wall Street ownership of timberland in Oregon? Those people are going to make out like bandits for the next 2 years for two reasons. One is Canadian timber is taken out of the market, so prices go up. Supply and demand. And that's the supply part. On the demand side, you're going to have this demand to build these new homes, rebuild homes. They're going to make out like bandits.
I just wonder, is it possible to switch our economy off of timber, at least wean off of timber?
Yes, but it depends on the meaning of switch off timber. If we mean, can we manipulate the political system so that we operate through the social license to operate and force them to do something different, I have very low hope for that. If we can at least incrementally start to take those external costs and move them over to internal, okay? If we take that map that said 1/4 of our carbon emissions come from timber harvest, if this state has the moxie to start to say, every one of those tons, you're going to have to pay a price. There is legislation that is proposed that would do that, that if you emit more than you sequester, you pay a tax. If you sequester more than you emit, you get paid. And if we start to get that started, California started at a very, very low number. They're pushing it up all of the time. It was threatened. They got it reinstated this last legislative session. It looks like it will stick. If there is a sort of gray lining to the Trump cloud, it is that it has put pressure on the governors to actually say something that's meaningful. If we can get our governor to do that, why does this state more carbon fiber per acre than any other place in the world? We have the forest scientists as good as anywhere in the world. We have the forest economists as good as anywhere in the world. Why do we not have a forest climate program in this state? Why has the governor never convened a task force to set that up? It's mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling.
There is an attempt with this healthy jobs, what's it called, SB 1070. They're trying, it is an attempt to put a price on sequestered carbon so that it can be balanced. But it's kind of a cap and trade thing, but it has some promise that people are trying to work on getting the forest into that equation.
One of the reasons I do this is that I have seen in my lifetime how many initiatives, how many attempts in the legislature. Beyond Toxic had this attempt to just say, geez, just let us know when you're going to spray and kill us, okay? And got killed in the legislature. And the reason it gets killed is because the industry goes out and says, you've got to let us go ahead in order to have good jobs. You've got to do this in order to have good public services in rural communities. You've got to do this because we are this wonderful industry. Now, you reach your own conclusion. I know what my conclusion is.
SB 1070 has a good chance of passing.
Okay, I'm sorry I need to go because people are, thank you very much.
So, one of the assumptions of our group, community rights, is that smaller units of government will make wiser choices than larger units. But your talk kind of brings up a question of whether that's really true. Maybe maybe if these decisions were made at Lane County level, they wouldn't be any wiser than they are at the state level or at the federal level. And this kind of turns upside down a lot of movements, like the Cascadia movement, that assumes if we can get more autonomy locally, that we'll make wiser choices. So I'd like to know, do you think we would make wiser choices?
Part of my growing up, one of the best examples that I know of is the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act was implemented because you had polluters in Ohio sending their garbage up, and it came down in New York. And as long as you had states allowed to make those decisions one by one, that's exactly what we're going to do. As long as the industry can push off costs onto you folks by spraying, and it comes down and kills your dog and your cat or your kids, they'll do it. Larger units of government are the only mechanism, institutional mechanism that we have for internalizing those costs that external go across a border. Now, the flip side of that is that when you start to have that power concentrated, then power goes to power and small communities get screwed. So it's some mixture that you have to have.
From a community rights point of view, when the government isn't listening to us, we have to talk to one another. We quit talking to the government. So in a case like that, there's empowerment that happens at the local level. And this is not the only community rights county. It's growing. This is a movement that's growing internationally. It starts here at home. Local communities start saying, no freaking way, corporations, this is my turf, this is our turf, we're going to protect it. And it's a feisty position, but really it's a super empowering position. And here we are, we're the people who say, this is a messed up system, what are we just going to roll over and keep calling our government officials and begging? It's not happening there. Ask Beyond Toxics.
So I believe in local activism and local stewardship of natural resources. I think it's going to continue to be important in the state. And I think, and would be interested in your response to the connection of the Northwest Forest Plan and a similar time frame of when real estate investment trusts and timber investment management organizations were legalized. I think it was 96, which gave Wall Street this ownership over our forests. And I believe that these scenarios will be entirely different as can be in the future if these resources are owned locally and the money is returned locally.
I understand that sentiment. I also, however, grew up at a time when Oak Ridge had its mill owners, Lebanon had its mill owners, every community, Cresswell had its mill owners. And my memory does not convince me that those situations led to good outcomes. In part because people have very narrow self-interests, and in part because you have people with power in those communities can exploit those self-interests, and in part because our species tends to look down at our feet rather than at the horizon, and certainly we don't look at the horizon of somebody who lives beyond the horizon. And so back to the earlier question, do we need these larger perspectives? I think we absolutely do. Wall Street ownership can be good if we force it to be good. If we don't, then they ain't. And we have a long history of the bad guys are bankers. Okay, we sort of grew up in a post-war, post-depression. We grew up where the bankers were sort of under control. Beginning with Ronald Reagan, we're living back in our great-grandparents' era where bankers have that kind of control. Do we need to go through a depression? Well, FDR demonstrated that we can get it under control, more or less.
And the frequency of wildfires increase exponentially.
Let's make this the last one. I'm actually working on this issue right now with fires and all of that. It's a very complex issue, and I'm not the scientist, so I don't want you to go away and say that I said what the science was. But my understanding is that there is a there is a fuel component to this, to the particular issue, and there is a climate component to it. The fuel issue isn't really very important until the climate issue becomes extreme. When climate becomes extreme, very hot, very dry, very windy, there is essentially nothing that you can do. You can have trees stacked like this. If this one catches on fire and the wind's blowing this way, the next tree goes. You can have buildings. If this one catches on fire, the next one goes. Now, there are, in fact, things that you can do, and so the message is not that, I think, the message is not that we're going to zero or to the apocalypse in 10 years. The message is we're going to incur tremendous costs that we have deferred for 150 years. We are going to incur those costs one way or the other. And so I actually live out in the wild urban interface. And basically, California is a long ways ahead of us. Oregon isn't paying any attention to it yet. California has some very, very good prescriptions on what to do at your house. So for example, put a metal roof on your house. Jesus, that's expensive. Okay, then let your house burn down. Oh, okay. Cut down all of these pretty bushes that you have on your property because they catch fire and set the trees on fire. But I really like those bushes. Okay, then let your house burn down. These costs are coming back to us. It's not that we are at the apocalypse and so, okay, let's go get drunk for the next 10 years and, to hell with it. We have to make some very, very tough decisions. And right now we have a political system on the social license to operate across very land use or water use or timber or whatever that isn't dealing with that. And God help us for the guy that we have in charge of all of this. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.